When you have a document that's very complicated and there's a lot of stuff on there, being able to change the stacking order might not be enough to keep your stuff organized. The file I have open is called Professor, and you'll find it in the Chapter 7 folder of the project files. This is Professor Lester, who is a character from a series of books I co-authored many years ago. Let's see what's going on with this. If you click any part of this image, you'll notice that these are all individual. There's nothing that's grouped. We don't have compound paths. And you see it's just very easy to mess the thing up to start destroying it. I'll just press Control Z or Command Z to undo that. And all of the parts here, whether it's the computer, the desk, the professor, everything is all individual little pieces. And that could be very dangerous because it would be very easy to ruin this. So let's see what's happening as far as layers are concerned. By default, you will always have one layer. That is, every Illustrator document has to have at least one layer. To bring up the Layers panel, there's a few ways of doing it. Over here on the right side towards the bottom, you have Layers. That'll bring it up. Close that for a second. You could also use a shortcut, which is F7. And incidentally, if you're an Adobe Photoshop user, it's the same shortcut. You could also go up to the Window menu, and from the Window menu, over here, turn Layers on and off. I'm going to drag the Layers panel out onto the page just to make it a little easier to see what we're doing. So here's the one layer. Nothing is selected, doesn't have to be right now. And you see we have this eyeball, and the eyeball will simply toggle visibility on and off. So right now the eyeball is on, we see everything. I click to turn the eyeball off, everything disappears. Let's turn that back on again. We also have this little dot here, and that dot is a way of selecting stuff. So let me just click on the blank page here to deselect. Well, we also have this little twirly arrow, and click to twirl it down, and now we see all the component parts. I'm going to stretch out this panel so we can see more of what's going on. And this looks like a mess, doesn't it? And you see each of these paths is just another part of the professor or the computer, and selecting the sublayer itself, right? This is the overall layer, these are sublayers, doesn't really do anything unless you click the dot. And when you click the dot, then you see something is actually selected. Also, when I have something selected, I have this little indicator telling me, oh yes, that's the object that is selected. So for example, maybe if I click on the professor's nose, and that selects, well, most of his head, then, well, I don't see anything here selected, but if I drag down eventually, okay, there is this path, this part of his head that's selected. So the dot is kind of like a bullseye, and we can see that little box there. Now, one way of organizing this is to group stuff. When you group objects, that group becomes a sublayer. Let's try this. First of all, I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to click the little twirly arrow here, and let's select the light bulb. And one way you can do it, I have the regular selection tool here. I'm going to click and drag down here. I want to make sure to select all of the rays, all the photons there, and I want to come down and make sure I select all the parts of the light bulb, but I'm being very careful not to drag this marquee onto the professor's head because I want him selected just the parts of the light bulb. Okay, so now these are selected. I want to create a group. I'll press Control G or Command G on the Mac, or you could go up to the Object menu and choose Group. And I'll click off it, and just to prove that it's a group, if I click any part of it, that's now selected. When I go to the little twirly arrow, I can see here's a group, there's a little thumbnail of the light bulb, and if I click the eyeball to turn it off, now you see I've hidden that group of objects, and I can turn the eyeball back on again to make them visible again. But still within the group, we have this little twirly arrow. Within the group, we see the individual paths, and we can still select individual parts inside that group. So if you watched the lessons earlier in this course about how to go into isolation mode for an object in a group, or how to use the group selection tool in the toolbar, this is sort of another way of selecting objects that are in a group without having to ungroup first. But what I really want to do is I want to create a group of the computer and the desk, and then let's create a group of the professor. So I'm going to click off it. Now, using the regular selection tool, I'll select most of it, but if I start doing something like this, I'm going to end up selecting too much. So this calls for the lasso tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to press Control plus or Command plus on the Mac, just so I can see it a little better. And now I'm going to go over here and get the lasso tool. I'll start with my mouse pointer maybe up here. And I'll just drag around. And I'm being very careful not to select the text. Go in this little area, this little gap here, and I'm making sure not to touch the professor. And I can end with the mouse pointer right up there. I don't have to close it all the way. Now we can see all of these parts are selected. I'll go and get the regular selection tool just to make sure. And now again I'll group. Instead of pressing Control G or Command G, this time I'll go up to the Object menu and group. Okay, and now we can do the same with the professor. We'll use the hand tool to come over here. And there's actually a couple of ways I can select the professor. I could select all and then deselect the light bulb and deselect the computer desk group and deselect the text. Or I could go back to the lasso tool, whichever floats your boat, whatever you find easier. It's okay if you touch the professor, but you don't want to touch any of the other objects. Okay, there we go. And again, I'll get the selection tool. Yes, indeed. I see I do have the professor selected, and I'll press Control G or Command G. And now the professor is a group. Click on the background to deselect. I'll twirl up all the twirly arrows. And now look what's going on. This is a lot neater, isn't it? We have layer 1, and within layer 1, we have 3 groups. Let's toggle the eyeballs. Actually, I'm going to press Control 0 to fit this in window. And if I toggle off this eyeball here, that's the desk and the computer. Oh, but you see the text is part of it. And I'll do the same for this group. That's the light bulb. The same for this group. That's the professor. So let's split each of these groups into its own layer. So the first thing I'm going to do is now I have just this one layer. I'll go down here on the bottom so we have a bunch of icons. And the second to last one here, if you roll your mouse over, it tells you Create New Layer. So I'm going to do that. And because I have only one layer, the new layer goes above it. So let's start with the light bulb here. I'm going to click the light bulb. Now I want to select it. So I could either click the little dot here or I could click the light bulb itself. Either way will make it selected. And now you see we have this little box. I'm going to take this box and I'm going to drag this box straight up over here so it's into that little space there in layer 2 and let go. Now you see this is red, this little box is red, and we have the selection is red. Now that doesn't mean we've changed the color of the object. If we print it or if we turn this into a web page or something like that, it's not going to be red. It's just for our convenience so that we know which layer is selected just by looking at the color. Now let's do that again. I'll click here to deselect, and maybe I'll take the desk with the computer and the text, and I want to split those off into its own layer. So once again, I'll go down here and I'll click the Create New Layer button. We have that. Now last time I selected by clicking the dot. This time I'll click the desk and I have that selected. And I'll take this little box and I'll drag this over here. And now that's green. Just a random color really. And you see what remained was the professor. Now let me just deselect. We could give these names. So instead of this layer 3, I'll call it desk. And I'll double click on the word layer 3. I'll call this desk and press enter. And then we have this layer 2 is going to be the light bulb, so I'll double click that and I'll call it light bulb. You have to press enter when you're done typing. And this original layer 1, that's a professor, so I'll double click that and I'll call this professor. And press enter. And I can twirl this up. And now, kind of like with groups, I can turn the eyeballs on and off for each layer. Now let's split the text off into its own layer. So that's on the desk layer, and I know because if I turn the eyeball off and on, I see it. Let's open this up. Now we have the group. Let's open up the group. And I've got all kinds of stuff. Now you can see up here on top the little wording here. So I see that's what that wording is. Now I can't really stretch this, but if I stretch the panel out enough, I can see what that is. Stretch it back. And I can turn, see that? No, I can turn the eyeball on and off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the desk layer, the overall layer there, and then down here on bottom I'll click Create New Layer. So now I have this layer 4, and now I'll select the text, right? I could click the dot, or I could click the text itself and drag this box up here. So now we can close the group, we can close that, double click that, and I can make that, let's say, the text layer. And now I can turn that eyeball on and off. Okay, so what's really the point other than organization? Because I can just as easily group. Well, let's say I want to take this light bulb and drag it down over the professor's head. Now I can have it over the professor's head or behind the professor's head. When I take it, let's drag it kind of like that. The light bulb is on top of the professor's head because you can see here in the layers panel, it's over it. If I want to put the light bulb underneath, I simply take and I drag down below, and now because the light bulb is below the professor in the layers panel, the light bulb itself is underneath the professor on the artboard. Now, earlier in this chapter I talked about the send to back command or bring to front command. Layers override that. So let's say I decide that, after all, maybe I want the layer to be in front of the professor. When I click the light bulb and I try to bring to front, I could do that using the keyboard shortcut, or I could right-click and arrange and bring to front. And notice nothing happens. And really what's happening is, yes, I did bring the light bulb to front, but I brought it to the front just within its layer. So that bring to front will not affect the layer. I can take the professor, right-click, arrange, and send to back, and he will not go in back of the light bulb because that bring to front and send command is not stronger than the layers. Also, let's say if I take the text and I bring the text, let's say kind of on top here of the monitor, the text is now in front of the monitor because it's on top here in the layers panel. If I take it here and I drag down below the desk layer, you see where that horizontal drop bar is when I let go. Now the text is behind the monitor. Or I can always drag it back in front. Let me move it up here. You might be wondering what's going on with these little blank boxes. That's to lock a layer. So if I decide, let's say, this text, whether it's selected or not, I decide that this is exactly where I want it. I don't want to select it or delete it or anything by accident. I'll lock it. Put your mouse pointer right here on this empty box. You see the little pop-up says toggles lock. Click, you have the little padlock, and now you can't select it. And even if you do a marquee selection, it's not. If you press Control A or Command A on the Mac, it will not be selected. And when you have a layer locked, everything inside the layer is also locked. By the way, nice little shortcut. If you decide that you want to lock a whole bunch of layers in a row, you don't have to click, click, click each one. If you put your mouse pointer on, let's say, this one here, you could just click and drag straight down and lock everything. Or if I want to unlock, I can click and drag straight up and unlock everything. The same with the eyeballs. I can click and drag down or click and drag up if I want to make multiple layers visible or not visible in a row. So you might not always need to use layers, but when you have a lot of objects on your artboard, layers come in very handy. It's a very good way of staying organized.